I'm Sally Ashworth, Head of Media for Harvard Business Review Press here in the UK, and today I'm pleased to welcome Rasmus Hougaard. Rasmus is founder and CEO of Potential Project, a global research, leadership development and consulting firm that partners with organizations to unleash the power of the mind. Rasmus is also the author of many articles for Harvard Business Review and, with Jacqueline Carter, 2 books, The Mind of the Leader and now Compassionate Leadership. In this book, Rasmus tackles the perennial problem that leaders face: how to create connected, caring and supportive workplaces and still make tough decisions for the good of the company, decisions that will sometimes impact negatively on the lives of employees, moving location, reorganizing departments, terminating contracts and laying off staff. How can we do the hard things that come with the responsibility of leadership while remaining good people and bringing out the best in others? That'll be the focus of today's seminar. I will hand over to Rasmus in a second. Just quickly, a few formalities. We'll be online for an hour as normal. Rasmus will present for about 45 minutes and then we'll have time for your questions. We're using 2 boxes, the chat box and the Q&A. The Q&A is for your questions and the chat box is for any comments that you have. So feel free to chat any questions into Rasmus in the Q&A box as soon as you're ready. Remember to select everyone in that chat menu if you want everyone, not just our presenters, to see your contributions. And our colleague John is on hand for technical problems. The chat box is where you contact him if you need any help. All right, that's me. That's all done now. Thank you, Rasmus. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sal. Great to be here together. And hello, everybody out there. Really wonderful to see you all streaming into the room. And I have to say, I'm thrilled to see such a big interest in this one, not because it's me or because it's our book, but because the topic of what we'll be talking about, at least to me, is so incredibly important. How do we become better human beings, and especially as professionals? And the fact that so many of you are signing up for this is a sign that I'm not alone. And that's a good thing, because if there's anything the world needs, I think it is definitely more compassion. And the good news that we'll be seeing and talking about is that the research is also showing that compassion, while it's a nice thing to have in business, it's also a really important thing to have. I'll be sharing some of the data from the research that we did for the book, so that you can see that it is not just my opinions, but it is actually a lot of hardcore data that supports this. So for this session, while I obviously will be doing most of the talking, given that there are so many out there online today, there will be a number of activities for you to engage in. There'll be some chat, there'll be some polls, and towards the, let's say, half hour of the session, there'll be a lot of tips. So it will not just be let's say data, research and a boring speech, but there'll actually be really practical tips. You'll be walking away with 12 pieces of really practical things that you can start to adopt right away. So with that and without any further ado, I would like to start with a question for you to just take a moment to consider, and then put an answer into the chat box. And I know that will mean a lot of activity in the chat box. But if you could, in one word, describe what do you see as the most pressing challenge for leaders today? It could be in your own experience, in your leadership, or what you see is needed for other leaders. So in one word, what do you see as the most pressing challenge for leaders today? And put it in the chat. And then I'll just read aloud: employee retention, managing change, balance, trust, presence, pandemic, balancing, care, people, the amount of change, engagement, resilience, community, holding complexity, adapting, trust. Okay, I think I'll stop reading here. I think as I'm just scrolling through, there's a pretty strong pattern here, that while there are a few that writes revenue and turnover and so on, it's mostly about the human side of leadership. It is how do you develop trust, how do you develop balance, I guess, for both yourself, but also for the people you're leading, and so on. And indeed, that is one of the most challenging parts of leadership, the human part, if not the most. We'll come to that in a moment. So in potential projects, we've been around for some 14 years. And as Sally said, we're working with a number of hundreds of large organizations like Cisco and Accenture and Microsoft and Cisco and so on, ultimately to create a more human world of work, starting with the mind. And this thing about the mind is really important because from our perspective and from a research study we did together with Harvard Business Review some 5 years ago now, leadership starts with the mind. It is the mind that creates our behavior that shapes the people we lead, and the people we lead create the culture of the organization and thereby determine its performance. So really leadership starts with the mind. That is a fundamental truth. We have to understand ourselves so that we can lead ourselves. When we can understand and lead ourselves, we can understand and lead other people, and thereby understand and lead the culture, the system, the organization, whatever we want to call it. That is the starting point of leadership. So this is something that we have talked about for quite a few years now. And then we started to ask ourselves a question some years ago. So what is the real hard side of leadership? Where is it that leaders are truly struggling? And that is what this new book is about. And for those of you that are really lazy and that don't want to pick up the book and read it, or that would rather sleep through this session, here is an ultimate executive summary of what we'll be doing for the next 50 minutes. And I'll just read it up here. One of the biggest challenges for leaders is how to do hard things in a human way. Too many leaders think they need to make a choice between being hard and being human, but in fact, doing hard things is often the most human thing to do. And the ability to combine these two seeming opposites comes down to one thing: compassionate leadership. And it is very possible. And that is what I'll be giving you some tips about. How do you develop compassionate leadership where you're balancing the heart with the human, driving for performance while being caring. It is not a dichotomy. They are not opposites. They go very well together if we can train ourselves to do that. That's what we'll do today. And then I should say also, because Sally is here from HBR, definitely you should get the book because it is a good book. My dad, he was the first one to read it and he said it was a really good book. I trust him, so go and get it. Having said that, all right, I'm just teasing. We did a big research study for this book. We interviewed around 350 executives from Microsoft, Accenture, Netflix, and so on, and we collected more than 1 million data points together with Harvard and Forbes from around 75,000 leaders in more than 1,000 companies in 72 countries. So it's a pretty extensive data set. And then we've been collaborating with Harvard Business School, Columbia Business School, Berkeley, Rutman, and Amsterdam Business Schools to crunch all this data and come to some conclusions about how do we as leaders do hard things in a human way. That's ultimately it. And then I'll just share the good news up front. And again, if you just want the very, very quick version, this is the one single slide that you should understand. Basically, leadership impacts multiplies when you are able to combine the heart with the human, driving for performance while being caring. What you see at the bottom here is the qualities of job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and so on of the people we lead. And then we can see the bars are showing that in the case of the dark blue one, job satisfaction. If you as a leader is very high on compassion, you can see that your employees will have some 35% higher job satisfaction. That's great. And if you're high on wisdom, and I'll define that in a moment, or high on drive and so on, then you'll also have an increase in that. But if you can combine those two, basically break the dichotomy and integrate care and performance, then you have more than almost 2.5 times the impact. And you can see the same across the board. So being able to balance these two is a real sweet spot of leadership. Question is, how do we do it? And that's again what we'll be looking at today. But to really understand, first of all, what is compassion, it's important to just define that a little bit. And we can do that by this simple graph here, where on one hand you have the willingness to act when you see someone in pain. And on the other end, you have the understanding of the person's experience. And all the way down at the bottom, not a lot of either. You just have pity. I feel sorry for you, but I'm not going to do anything, and I don't really care that much. Next, you have sympathy. I feel for you. A little better, but really not that helpful for anyone either. When you come into empathy, I feel with you. I come into a room, someone is suffering, I sit down, and I literally feel the pain, the suffering that they feel. That is nice for them because they feel they are not alone anymore. So it's a beautiful thing, and it is a deeply ingrained part of the human being, the human brain. However, in leadership, it is important to move out of empathy. Why? We'll see in a moment, and move into compassion, which is not an emotion, but it is the intention to be here to help. So it is a very action-oriented. So in a very simple way of putting this, empathy plus willingness to act equals compassion. I hope that's simple and clear, at least in theory. Just to give you a sense of the research on the difference, because we're not just talking words here, we're actually talking neurology and psychology. So empathy is when you share the suffering of someone else. Compassion is when you have the intent to alleviate that suffering. So empathy is an emotion, where compassion is an intention. And they show up in very different parts of the brain. And I'm showing this just so you know that I'm not talking semantics. I'm not talking words here. This is deeply in our brain. It is expressed in two very distinct, different ways. And then from a psychological perspective, for leaders, empathy has the downsides that when we repeatedly take on the suffering of the people we lead, we can experience distress and burnout. We can have more fleeting actions. We can have a lack of diversity because we empathize with those that are looking like ourselves or that are close to us. We can be more narrow-minded and actually make poor moral decisions. Whereas in compassion, when we as leaders show up with compassion, we have a stronger sense of empowerment, a stronger sense of control, more sustainable action. We create more social connection and more happiness for ourselves and the people we lead. Actually, our research found that leaders that show up with compassion versus empathy have a 200 times lower, a 200% lower risk of burnout. So compassion is a real strong way of also taking care of yourself. And then you may be thinking, okay, so this is all nice theory, but how do I know what's the difference? So why don't we look at that? So I would like to invite you to a little experience to understand, or to, let's say, experience the difference between empathy and compassion. This exercise is going to take about 4 minutes or so, and you may become a little bit emotional. That's very normal and not a problem. But to do it well, I'll invite you to close your eyes. That'll make it a little bit easier. And also just to get yourself settled in this session, take a moment to just notice your body and what your body feels like in this moment. Allow yourself to calm down. Take a moment to also notice your breath. Simply noticing the in-breath and the out-breath. And then now to get into the exercise of experiencing the difference, I'll invite you to think of a person that is close to you, someone that you really care about, that in recent times has experienced significant pain, suffering, whether mental or physical. And I'll invite you to imagine this person in front of you. like a few meters away from you, you see this person and you see the suffering, you see the pain that this person is or has just been going through. Maybe you see how their face is carrying pain or their body language. And then try and check in. How do you feel right now? And if you feel a sense of heaviness, maybe a bit of sadness, this is the experience of empathy. That is the literal experience of what empathy is. So imagine that you want to get into compassion to feel the difference. I'll help you to do that. And you can do that by taking a mental step away from the person. So imagine that you're moving a little bit away from the person to get a little bit of perspective on this person's situation. And you can also do that by asking yourself, what does this person need? What can I do to help? What can you do to help this person? And in asking that question, you're suddenly moving into a bit of action mode. Come up with 1 or 2 or 3 things that you can actually do, and choose one thing that you actually will do after the session or within the next, let's say, 48 hours. Send flowers or give them a call, pay them a visit. So make a commitment, you're going to help. And realize that while you may not be able to take away the pain and suffering, at least you're in a position you can actually do something to alleviate it a little bit. And then again, check in. How do you feel right now? And if you feel just slightly less heavy, less sad, then this is more the experience of compassion. The intent to be of service, the intent to help, to alleviate suffering. And with that, I'll invite you to let go of the entire exercise. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back to this room again. So it is that simple. And if we apply this to leadership, where in many cases we have the responsibility of many people, if we always lead with with empathy, we end up taking on a lot of suffering from a lot of people, which can become quite heavy. And if we do that repeatedly over time, especially in a time of pandemic with a lot of insecurity and uncertainty and pain, it can get very taxing to be a leader. Whereas if we manage to move out of the empathetic hijack and into compassion, we'll be in a much stronger place. So if we just take this step in a little bit of slow motion, imagine again, you see a person suffering or experiencing challenges. What happens literally in the brain is that we are activating a part of the brain that mirrors the experience that that person has. That is what we call the spark of empathy. We feel what they feel. It's also called emotional empathy. And the thing about it is that because human beings are innately good, we want to do good to others, it feels like a good thing. It feels like this is what we should do. And with that, we can get hijacked. I feel bad because that person feels bad. That must be the right thing to do. And then you get stuck in it. And then you can lead from or suffer from empathetic burnout. We want to shortcut this one and move into what is called rational empathy. So there is that moment of recognizing what the person is feeling. But then before you get hijacked in that emotion, You move into compassion by basically asking, how can I help? What is one thing that I can do to support this person from not feeling as bad as they feel right now? And remember, the most comforting for human beings is not to have the problem solved, but often just to know that there is someone there with the intention to help. And also remember, in leadership, not doing anything is often also a really powerful thing, but rather just lending a shoulder, lending an ear, lending a moment to just sit and be with this person. You don't need to fix everything. So you need to connect with empathy, but lead with compassion. I hope this made sense. So we'll just move a bit on, and with a quote from Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, who was part of the research for the book, who was telling about all his experiences of having to make really difficult decisions in his time as CEO of Unilever, like closing down, let's say, a tea plantation in India. And his quote here, if I would empathize with all my employees, I would never be able to make a single decision. You need to have empathy, but run a business with compassion. If you're empathizing with every single employee, you can never make any difficult decisions. And as a result, most companies probably wouldn't be here today. So we need to have that sense of compassion, which includes a sense of wisdom, understanding. So modern leadership in the 21st century requires compassion, which is the genuine care combined with an intention to support and help. And then wisdom, here with a simple definition, to have the courage to be transparent and do what needs to be done. So in all of the conversations with all these executives that we talked to, many of them shared that they could easily take billion-dollar decisions and sleep without any problems at night, no worries. But when they had to deliver a difficult message, they could be sleepless for hours. It is really, really hard. And therefore, a big part of wisdom is to have the courage to move into uncomfortable, difficult, confrontational situations with people, because that is what leadership is often about, making difficult decisions and executing on them. So this gives us a simple framework of, let's say, wise compassion, where on one hand you have caring versus uncaring, on the other wise, meaning courage, insight, knowledge, knowing how to motivate people, knowing how to do a business, as opposed to being ignorant. And in these 4 quadrants, we have first of all the first one, which we call caring avoidance, where we can let care or empathy be a barrier to action. This one is often when we are going to give tough feedback to someone that underperformed. But then just before we have to do it, we get a little bit concerned that this person is going to feel hurt. And then we end up not doing it. So we're letting care or empathy be a barrier to actually do what is the right and wise thing to do. It's not helpful for us because we will still have an underperforming team member. It's not good for the team because they'll be delusioned and disengaged. And it is certainly not good for the person because that person would never know that he or she didn't perform and therefore can't improve. And we all want to improve. So it is a very unkind thing actually to not give hard feedback. So first quadrant is very human, very natural, but is not good leadership. In the third quadrant, we are ineffective and indifferent. We're lacking care and we're not delivering results. Not a great place to be in. Having said that, probably most of you, and I can attest for myself leading a global organization of some 250 people, if I haven't slept well, and if I'm under real pressure and have many competing priorities, I can also end up in that space. So we all do that. In the fourth quadrant, we have uncaring execution. We're putting results for people's well-being. We can be really smart about manipulating people, driving, pushing, and people don't appreciate that because there's no care in that. So we can have short-term strong results, but long-term, people will find another place to work. And everybody now is concerned about the great attrition. The great attrition is coming very much from the fourth quadrant here. Then finally, we have the wise compassion, where we're doing hard things in a human way, which is the sweet spot of leadership, as we saw in the chart at the very beginning. But it's a difficult one because we feel that there is a dichotomy between the two. And so in a moment, we're going to come to how do you bring those together. But before we do that, I would like to just do a little poll here of everybody on this call. Which quadrant are you operating in most of the time? Most of the time, not all the time, because we're all cycling around depending on who we're with and so on. So in a moment, the poll will come up and I'll invite you all to just click one of them. Caring avoidance, wise compassion, ineffective indifference, or uncaring execution. And then when, John, you feel there are enough responses, if you can share the results. All right, coming up here. So we can see a good 37% feel that they are operating from caring avoidance. Thank you so much for the honesty. And I would say it is in some ways a beautiful trait to be operating from there, because when you operate from there, then you're actually just trying to be a good human being. We then saw that there were 48% that were operating from wise compassion. That's great. And the last distributed over the two last ones. This is somewhat cohesive with what we saw in our research, where we saw that out of 20,000 leaders, 42 were in the wise compassion, only 16 though in caring avoidance. And I think that says something about the specific population on this call today that have chosen this specific topic to spend an hour on a Tuesday. But what we can see here is some 22% operating from ineffective indifference, which is a real shame because there is such a lack of good leadership there and the great attrition happening from here for sure. What we saw overall is that, and I'll just share a bit of data and then we'll come to some practical tips for you all. What we saw in the research is that majority of leaders are pretty alarmingly out of sync with their people, and that is leading to some negative outcomes. What we're talking about here is what researchers call shared reality, that a leader and his or her follower or employee or coworker, whatever you want to call it, that they have a somewhat equal understanding of, let's say, the kindness, humanity, wisdom of the leader, that the leader would rate themselves as X%, and that the follower would say more or less the same. That is what we call a we leader, where there is a synchronicity between what the employee feels and what the leader feels. That's really a good place. What we can see is that good followership, good retention, good employee engagement, and many other things come out of this. But then we have the 55% that are out of sync. That's a pretty high number. The first category here are the me leaders, the ones that overestimate how compassionate they are as opposed to how they are rated by their employees. And the negative impacts on the followers here. So if you as a leader overestimate how compassionate you are, then your people will generally have a 32% higher risk of burnout and a 37% less organizational commitment and 27% less job satisfaction. Not a good place. And the you leader are the exact opposite. It's those of us that feel that we are not that kind as leaders, but our people actually find that we are much kinder than we feel. While that could sound like a noble and good thing, it is not, because there is not synchronicity. So not good shared reality and thereby collaboration. And as we can see here, the negative impact for leaders in this case is that we have an 18% risk of burnout, or higher risk of burnout, 42% higher intention to quit, and 10% higher stress. So what we want to achieve, obviously, is to get into the sync in the we leader quadrant. And just to give a few more data points, just because we love data, and I know many of you are keen on data as well. One piece of data showed, or one piece, a big part of the data showed that climbing the corporate ladder, basically raising in ranks, can lead to leaders being perceived as less compassionate. And you can see that here on the red line, where executives are self-rating themselves as very high on wisdom, courage, knowledge, understanding of business, and so on, and quite high on compassion, where their followers are rating them very low on compassion and not very high on wisdom. And if you go and see the opposite, I think, yeah, okay, so there, sorry for not having my animations right. The other thing here to look at is the team leads, which was the lowest category in the ranking, where you can see team leads are by followers generally rated as pretty compassionate, while they themselves don't see themselves that way. So as we raise through ranks in our career, we are generally perceived as less compassionate. Question is what we can do about that, and we'll get to that. Another part of the study find that leaders in certain industries tend to overestimate their compassion and wisdom versus how they are perceived by followers. This is also really interesting, and I think most of you will find yourself in either of these industries. So just take a moment to have a look at this. One thing that I find is quite interesting about this one is if you look at government and technology, they are the exact opposites. Technology leaders find that they are both quite compassionate and high on wisdom, whereas technology employees find that their leaders are certainly not either of those. Whereas government leaders find that they are quite low on both, but their employees find the exact opposites. Last one, female leaders mostly underrate themselves, and leaders mostly overrate themselves versus how they're perceived by the followers. So this is a very interesting piece of data. Basically, we as males think that we are more compassionate and wise as leaders than women generally do, but it is the exact opposite for how we're perceived by our followers. So a little bit of work to do for both genders if we want to create shared reality, synchronicity. One piece of data that I didn't put in slides today, but is that if you're thinking of what are the best leaders, and what I'm saying now is obviously grossly generalized, but the data was very clear about it though. If you think about four constellational leaders, female leader to female follower, then female leader to male follower, then male follower leader to female follower, and male to male. Which of those would you think is the best constellation for the followers? All right, I can share that female to female was significantly the best. Then it was female to male, then it was male to female, and then it was male to male. And I can only share this because I'm a male myself, and my wonderful colleague Jacqueline would never share this in a session like this. And it's not to say that we as males are not good leaders, but generally females, because they are not overestimating their compassion, generally have better resonance with their people and therefore better followership. Very interesting piece of data. All right, enough data. Now let's get to what can we do to become more wise, compassionate leaders. In other words, how can we get into that second quadrant, that quadrant of wise, compassionate leadership? In our research and all the interviews we did, we found that there are 4 things that you need to work on. First of all, caring presence, the ability to be here now when you do hard things, to be really present with the ones that you're with when you're doing whatever is hard, whatever difficult conversation, whatever feedback, restructure, whatever. That's the first one. The second one is caring courage, to have the courage to go into those difficult conversations, which, by the way, you can only do when you're actually present in that situation. Courage over comfort. It is always comfortable to refrain from doing the hard things, but it will never lead you to grow or the people you're working with. Again, here the word caring is important. The caring is the compassion, the courage is the wisdom. Thirdly, when we then have the courage and we go into the difficult situation, to have caring candor, to have the ability to be really candid and direct, but in a caring way. It is very different from radical candor or brutal honesty, all those other things where it's just about sharing the hard news. That doesn't work. You need to combine it with care. But with the mantra here that, at least in most cultures, direct is faster. If you're spending a lot of time beating around the bush and not getting to the core of the issue, one, you're wasting time. Two, more importantly, you're making it unclear for others what you're actually trying to say. So caring candor, because direct is faster, mostly. Then when you have that, you can move into the final step of being really caringly transparent. Because being transparent or clear is a really kind thing to do. It is only when you are transparent about the difficulties that may be coming, or the uncertainty of the future, or the financial downturn that you see will be coming, whatever it is. When you are clear and transparent about those things, you are treating people as adults and giving them a chance to act in the most appropriate way for them in their own situation. Whereas if you're withholding that, you're not giving them a chance. So it's not compassion, it's not kind, and it is not wise. When you as a leader, or I would say parent or friend or a child, whatever, to other people, when you're doing this, you are creating a culture where people feel they are empowered to be caringly present, caringly candid, courageous, candid, and then transparent, and thereby creating a culture in your team of trust, psychological safety, and thereby performance. So I'd like to just do another poll, which is, which of the 4 qualities is an area of development for you? Which of these 4 areas do you feel you have the most potential to develop? And please take your time and just put in whatever is your choice. And then in 10 seconds, John will share us the results. And here it comes. 15, 32, 32, and 21. That's a fairly even distribution, but not surprisingly, that the caring courage and the caring candor are a little bit more difficult. Why is it that it is more difficult to be courageous and candid? It is because we are moving in to a space where we feel we are hurting others. And that's not nice. We don't like to do that. But that's also the beauty of it, because it is when we do that, that people actually develop and they get clarity. So as I said in the beginning, compassion and wisdom, or drive and care, are very interlinked. That is the whole truth here. So what I'll do for the next few minutes is to give you 3 tips for how you can better develop your skills or your capabilities within each of these areas, so that you have something really practical to leave with today. And after that, we'll almost be at the end and we'll go into questions and answers. So please, if you have any questions, drop it in the Q&A box and Sally will moderate that in about 7 minutes. So 3 tips for how to have caring presence. First one, obviously, live by the mantra of be here now. Be here now when you're doing difficult things. And then 3 really practical things. Use the power of the pause. Every time you're about to go into a team meeting, any kind of difficult conversation, do 1 minute of just pausing. Just sit down on a chair, rest, breathe, and let go of all your thoughts so that you can come into the situation with a clear mind and thereby be more present. Secondly, bring an intention to benefit and bring an intention into all your conversations. And to do that a little bit better, start your day with what we call a 2-2-2. Before you start your day, take 2 minutes just to sit in front of your computer before you actually look at it and just breathe for a few minutes. Then when you've done that, set the intention for the day and make it something along the lines of, today, I want to show up as a person that brings care and wisdom, or drive and humanness, whatever you want to call it, into all engagements with all people. And then with that intention, think about what is most important today, and then put that into your calendar. Make sure your calendar is based on being a good leader, a good human being, rather than just an executional manager. And thirdly, be curious and don't make assumptions, and double your instinctive ask-tell ratio. So how much do you tell versus how much do you ask? When you're in difficult conversations, really important to ask questions about their experience rather than you just telling. That's what we did in the 90s. Doesn't work anymore. The second one, caring courage. Choosing courage over comfort. First one, remember, comfort and growth cannot coexist. You cannot be in the comfort zone and grow at the same time. It is only when we get out of the comfort zone and do the difficult things that we start to grow, and that people start to grow. Because if you don't do that, they won't learn. So make a commitment to yourself to have at least one courageous confrontation every day. Secondly, avoid the empathy trap. And whenever you feel hijacked by someone's emotions, take a deep breath, check what's going on, release the emotion, take a step back, and ask yourself, what does this person need? And how can I help? And then thirdly, get peer support. So when you're going into a really difficult conversation, laying someone off or giving really tough feedback, talk to your peers about, what are you fearing? What are your worries? What are the different scenarios that can play out? So get peer support. The third step, carrying candor. Direct is faster. Don't wrap a hand grenade. Even if you wrap a hand grenade in bubble wrap, it's not going to make it less difficult to receive. So say what needs to be said first. When you go into a difficult conversation, don't talk about other things. Just go straight to the issue. When you've said that, then there is time for the person to unfold what that means and so on. So you start with a difficult message and then leave a lot of space for the person to process. That's your role as a leader. Second, don't beat around the bush. So personalize the statements that you have, like, it is my decision, or as far as I can see. Make it very clear that this is you that is sitting behind this. And thirdly, avoid the popularity game. The popularity game is something that most humans are suffering from. I am guilty as well. We like to be liked. But while it's important to be a good human as leader, it is not the most important to be liked. It is important to be respected for doing the right thing. So take a stance and do the right thing, even when it's difficult, and even if it means people will be upset with you. And then finally, carrying transparency. Clarity is kindness. Admit what you don't know. Oftentimes, you don't know the whole picture, and so share that you don't know. Secondly, seek clarity to enhance clarity. Check. Actually, is what I'm sharing here, is that also what people are hearing? Because oftentimes we are losing things in translation, and especially if it's a difficult message. So really check in, what did you just hear me saying, if you feel that they are not completely clear. And then finally, be vulnerable, ask for help, be authentic, and dare to care. So with all of this, you can develop this kind of leadership where you are much more caring and much more courageous, much more wisdom wise. That is a much better place to lead from. And I would like to just end with a last question and ask you to put your answers into chats. Which of the 4 qualities do you see as most important for leaders to develop in your organization? And so please open the chat box and just share either of these 4: presence, courage, candor, or transparency. And I'm just looking through very quickly here. I can see a lot of courage, some presence, and some candor, but definitely courage is number 1 here. All right, very good. The good news though, and I'll end on a positive note here. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll end on a positive note, is that while you may think, wow, this is difficult, and if I have to be better at being wise, compassionate, I have to go more into difficult conversations and so on. And yeah, that's true, you do, but that's a really good thing. Because if you think of leadership as a path of mutual growth, it is the challenges that you're facing with others that make you grow. In the background here, you see a coral. Corals are known for being stronger the more resistance they get. And it is very much the same in leadership. When we face resistance and have to go into difficult things, that's where we grow and that's where other people grow. And what our research showed was that people that are willing to go into the difficult places, those are the ones that really develop fast and are the ones that progress through their career. So see this as a wonderful opportunity for being not just a better human being, but a better leader, create better person and create better people around you. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention. And then we'll go over to Sally for moderating some Q&A here.
There are so many questions, and so in the chat as well as the Q&A. So forgive me if I don't reach yours. And if you have a pressing question that you put into the chat, pop it into the Q&A so that I can see it without it being crowded with all of the others. Rasmus, one kind of overarching question, I mean, a very practical one that's come through a lot is, you're dealing on the individual level, but you also mentioned how in some cases middle managers seem to be rated low, or there are disparities within an organization. And what would you do practically if someone's a middle manager who is compassionate and the leadership level is not? Are there ways in which you can work through this problem at an organizational level of there being disparities?
I think there's obviously the L&D, or the leadership development aspect of that, which is simply bringing this on the agenda. So if you're sitting there in this talk as an HR professional, all of this is trainable, and all of this is about a slight culture change in mindset. Then it's very trainable. If you're sitting as an individual that is thinking, how can I do this? I would say for middle managers, as also the data showed a little bit, it is generally not the care that is missing. It is more the wisdom, the ability to walk into the difficult conversations. And really, if you want to grow as a leader, that is the space you need to focus on.
There's an interesting kind of connected question from Laura Henderson here, wondering whether people lower down an organization, we say middle managers, are rated low, or they have difficulty enacting their compassion because they have to get sign off from higher up the organization. They're actually blocked.
So what was the question again? Sorry.
Whether do you think that is an issue, that people lower down an organization might actually have difficulty in enacting their compassion?
I think so. And I think also one of the reasons is that is as much as the leadership paradigms, the way that we see leadership today is very different than it was, say, in the 80s. We're still stuck, honestly, in a very militaristic, very 80s corporate, which is about being tough, and leaders are, strong managers and so on, that don't care. Oh, and it just makes me cringe to think of that, but it is still out there, and we can see that in our interviews, especially with middle managers up to senior managers. And if there's one thing that I would say to if there's any of you out there that is still getting that vibe of it's about being tough, leadership today is about unlearning management and relearning being human. If you can be a good human, people are going to really appreciate you, and they will stick with you and they will follow you, and they're going to make you look good. But if you're trying to stick to old dated managerial ideas, it's going to be a long, long, lonely road.
Yeah. I have a question from Eduardo. Has remote working changed the issue at all? Is it more difficult now to be there, to be present when you're
Yeah,
not present?
yeah. It's a really good question, and I think there are two things around this. First of all, yes, it is more difficult to be present when we're not meeting around the water cooler and when we're not seeing body language, but we're just seeing this 2D little screen thing. It is much more difficult as a leader to be really present. Or let's say it takes more time. It is really important that you are creating white space in your team meetings and certainly in your one-on-ones. Don't start a meeting just going straight to the agenda, but take the first 1, 2, 3 minutes just to check in. Hey, how are you doing? I mean, how are you really doing? And how are your kids? And how are things at home? And give time for that. That is so important. The other part is the pandemic has made everything we talk about today way more important because people are more vulnerable, more fragile, and they're really looking for leaders to be more caring than even just 2 years ago. So there's a massive need for this.
A broader question here, actually, it's come up a lot about culture and different cultures, and I'm sure that we're not just talking about geographically, we're probably also talking about different industries and stuff, but are there different, do you need to approach this in different ways for different cultures? Richard says you can see in his work, and I think he mentioned he works in China a lot, I'm not certain, but with his work, it's more useful to work on relation and gratitude first, business second. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely, very true. Um, that is very much part of the whole caring presence part. That's where it started with that, like being really present with people, having the whole human being and not just a message. And then on the cultural piece, um, presence is the same no matter what culture. Courage is the same no matter what culture, but the directness is not the same for every culture, especially in some Asian cultures, including Japan, Korea, also India and China. Directness, which is very normal in parts of Europe and the US, can be misperceived or understood in the wrong way in other cultures. And that's why you need to then double down on the presence and the courage before you move into being direct. You have to be less direct in some cultures than others.
Would you say, I mean, this just feed a little bit into how learnable this stuff is, in that this sounds very intuitive. You kind of gauge the response and you work out whether or not it's being received or it's working in the right way. But you're quite, clear that this is learnable. Where does that, it's a difficult balance.
Mm. It,
Um,
yeah.
sorry, I'm
No,
sorry. Have you got any comments on that? It wasn't really a question.
no, but just to point, as you say, it is learnable, and that is such an important thing. This is not something we are or are not. I can see myself in my role as a CEO in the early days. I was so conflict averse. Like I would shy away from any kind of conflict, and I'm sure most of you out there right now are looking at yourself and nodding, and yeah, I was like that too, or I'm still like that, because that's a very human thing. I can just see that it really helps my people when I'm being much more direct and they're asking for it, they're craving it. We all do, we all want feedback. So it is very trainable. It just takes time.
I have a question from Kate. Are leaders ever promoted or rewarded for their compassion? Would this make a difference too? Would it make a difference? HR process are not or don't tend to be focused on this.
Yeah, very true. Very true. At least for still a good majority of companies, it is not. But imagine those companies that have started to embrace this over the past few years, and I can speak about the ones we work with that are starting to bring compassion as a quality into recruiting, into compensation, into benefits, into performance management. The change of culture that we're seeing is just astounding. It is amazing. And if you're just looking at the humanness that starts to flourish in those organizations, the impact it have on all levels and how they bring it back to their communities and families, it is so the right thing to do. And as we can see, it's also good for business.
And I suppose to follow on from that, is there an easy way of, do you have a method for kind of assessing that? Could you do an annual assessment that?
Yeah. So as part of this work and all of the research, or a good part of the research that I was sharing is coming from an assessment our research team has developed over the past years called the Human Leader Assessment. So yeah, it can be absolutely assessed. Everything from how do your leaders score on empathy versus compassion, on courage versus, on wisdom versus compassion, and a lot of the things in between. It can be absolutely measured. Yeah.
And
If
so
anybody's
that,
interested, reach out to us. We can help them with this assessment. Very easy.
So that links neatly into, can you tie business results to this? I mean, ultimately, to compassion.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's why I put that one slide up front. If people are more engaged, if people have better job satisfaction, if they have better performance, if they have better retention, I mean, you've got the business case there, and it is very, very significant. So yes, absolutely.
Now, we have so many more questions, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up here because there won't be an end to it. And that feels like a very good point to end on. Very helpful indeed. Rasmus, thank you so much for your time. And everyone, thank you for joining. This has been a phenomenal audience here. And thank you so much for the questions. I will share the recording of this session afterwards in the follow-up email. So look out for that. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Sally, so much for organizing.
Great. Thanks a lot.